That was interesting. Well, anyways, welcome back. I should say, I'm glad to be back. James Cordiner here. Voluntaryist Academy. Voluntaristacademy.com is the website. Come check that out. Link in the show notes. More on that later. I'm very happy to be back. It's been like a month. I know. It's been like a month. Geez, that ain't cool. But here we are. Tonight we're going to be continuing with the Men Against the State series. This is a history of anarchism in America. Tonight we're going to be covering a very important figure, a very important man, a man's man, an anarchist's man, a voluntarist's man. And his name is Lysander Spooner. Drop a comment in the chat. You might notice we got a little bit of a new overlay here. Been fiddling around. I've been on my off time, taking a little bit of a break. I've been doing a little streaming of some video games, and it inspired me to get a new overlay and all this stuff. But you guys don't want to hear about that. You're like, video games? What the hell, man? Teach us about voluntarism already. Okay, fine. So here's the new overlay. Welcome to Voluntarist Academy. Now we'll be able to see your comments on the air. As I'm reading, you can see your own comments. It's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful thing what a little bit of time off from your regularly scheduled broadcasting can really do, for the creative juices and your creative inspiration to kind of switch things up. But I'm very happy to be back. So anyways, without any further ado, I don't have my book cam set up, but Men Against the State, pretty good book, a few hundred pages, under 300 pages, this copy that I have here. And, by James J. Martin. And we've been covering this for many, many weeks. This is part 8, Dissident Among Dissidents, Lysander Spooner, chapter 7, part 1. The economic and social concepts which formed the basis of American anarchist thought were first stated by Josiah Warren. Most of the significant contributions of others, especially of an economic nature, were made by men with varying degrees of relationship to Warren. There was one important exception, Lysander Spooner, an independent radical whose political and economic writings paralleled those of the better-known group for many years. Regardless of the use made of his works, Spooner remained apart from the individualists except for brief instances of association during his later life, when his most powerful tracts in support of anarchist principles were written. By the 1880s, however, his works were being widely read by native, lowercase n, small n, anti-statists. The career of Spooner is that of a man whose radicalism increased rather than decreased with advancing age. He was born on January 19th of 1808 in Athol, Massachusetts. The early part of his life was spent on his father's farm, which he left at the age of 25 to become a clerk in the Office of Registry of Deeds in Worcester. He began the study of law shortly thereafter under John Davis and Charles A. Allen, jurists of considerable esteem in the state. Finding the practice of law closed to him by a statute which required 3 years of additional study on the part of non-college trained bar candidates, he conducted a campaign which secured the repeal of the statute. Spooner's first 7 years as a lawyer were spent in Ohio rather than in Massachusetts, however, during which time he participated in the rapidly spreading free thought campaign. The deists' reply to the alleged supernatural evidences of Christianity became one of the better-known pamphlets against religious orthodoxy. Its general tone gave an indication of his later disdain for constituted authority over other than the church. So Sounds to me like he didn't mind the church. The career of Spooner, the jurist, is far less important than that of Spooner, the critic of the Constitution and legislative processes. His criticisms were both economic and political in nature. The two overlapped and often came from his pen alternately, so that no clear separation can be observed. He regarded the Constitution primarily as a device which afforded opportunities to minority groups to exploit others through the instrument of special privileges. Let me clear that up, because this book was written in 1952. Okay? It's been almost 10 weeks. Can't blame anyone for getting... Well, actually, part 1 was recorded like 7 months ago. Regardless, when we see a word like minority used here, we're talking about a small group, a group of small size, not any demographic. So let's continue. The opportunity might accrue to private citizens or to a small group within the government at any particular time, but to him, the important fact lay in the manipulation of the, quote, fundamental law of the land, end quote, to the benefit of financial, commercial, and landed interests, and to select politicians. Footnote number 5 of this chapter in this PDF, which you can download off of voluntaristacademy.com. There's a link in the show notes. Now, I don't read every footnote, as you remember, but this one's, I think, important. Spooner did not believe that the Constitution was a class document. His earlier criticisms centered around its interpretation to the advantage of one element of the populace or another. After the Civil War, his attacks bore directly upon the very authority of the Constitution and grew in audacity and antagonism. If you want more footnotes, you can download the PDF. Do it. Let's continue with the main reading here. Where Spooner derived his interest in finance is not known. The 1837 panic undoubtedly was foremost among the sources. So when we hear the word panic in terms of finance, what we might call it today would be a recession or a depression. But back in the day, about every 10 years in America, after winning the war for independence, there would be a financial panic where state banks and even before the Federal Reserve, we'd have central banks. Jackson overthrew them during his term as president. That wasn't the first time the central banks were told to kick the bricks. It had happened. It had happened once before. A great series on the financial panics throughout the history of this country would be, and it's not in the show notes, I apologize, but it would be a series called The Trust Game, produced by Aaron and Melissa Dykes on Truth Stream Media, that you can find on YouTube. Again, that's The Trust Game from Truth Stream Media. So when we hear the word panic, that's what we're talking about. It's a financial panic. Banks don't have the money and blah, 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 blah. The principal impression he derived from the political controversy it produced was not the contest of personalities involved, but rather the nature of banking by private corporations and the increasing complication resulting from the activities of political and governmental bodies. To those interested in keeping credit open to competition and private pursuit, he issued a warning that a maze of artificial restrictions and legal escape mechanisms was in the early stages of construction. Such was the message of his Constitutional Law Relative to Credit, Currency, and Banking, published in 1843, portions of which were still being incorporated in the free banking literature of the anarchist press half a century later. All right, let's follow with a quote from the Constitutional Law Relative to Credit, Currency, and Banking. To issue bills of credit, that is, promissory notes, is a natural right. The right of banking or of contracting debts by giving promissory notes for the payment of money is as much a natural right as that of manufacturing cotton. So such was Spooner's premise in opening his attack upon the contention that state charters should be required to engage in the banking business. Banking was either a totally reprehensible activity and should be entirely suppressed, or all pretense at protection of the citizenry should be abandoned and the enterprise opened to all who wished to enter it. Spooner saw no escape from the logical conclusion that the intrusion of the federal government into matters of legal tender, bank chartering, and incorporation was based upon expediency. Spooner assumed that the constitutional clause forbidding the impairment of the obligation of contracts was an acknowledgement of the natural right of men to make contracts. Okay. There was no doubt in his mind that creation of compulsory legal tender and granting of bank charters were direct infringements of contracts. The making of a contract, he said, was an quote-unquote act of real persons and was of necessity restricted to persons, for there were no others who could do so. Therefore, he declared, and you can find this quote in the constitutional law relative to banking credit. You know, it's a long title, but I said it a couple minutes ago. Anyways, to quote, the idea of a joint incorporeal being, meaning not a physical being, does not have a physical body. Okay? Incorporeal being, made up of several real persons, is nothing but a fiction. It has no reality in it. It is a fiction adopted merely to get rid of the consequences of facts. An act of legislation cannot transform 20 living, real persons into one joint, incorporeal being. After all the legislative juggling that can be devised, quote unquote, the company will still be nothing more, less, or other than the individuals composing the company. The idea of an incorporeal being capable of carrying on banking operations is ridiculous. What is the impact of such incorporation? Spooner said it freed men of contractual obligations as individuals. When profits accrued from banking operations, the stockholders in whose names the chartering had taken place appeared as individuals to collect, yet the cloak of anonymity was there to protect them as individuals in case of losses. Escape through the provision of a collective personality was at hand. When liability for their contracts, beyond their ability or desire to meet as individuals, presented itself to the banking company. So this is basically saying that when they're doing well, the individuals flourish and do well for themselves. When they're doing bad, the individuals don't feel the consequences because it's the company that feels the consequences. Okay? Radical individualist anarchist. This is why he is a dissident of dissidents. Anyways, let's continue. Thus, a hypothetical financial firm with total capital of $50,000 might signify its intention to enter the business of banking to the extent of $10,000, issue the sum of $40,000 in unconditional promises to pay, and then default on this latter sum, losing only the original amount which they intended to risk. The desire to limit the extent of promises, either of companies or of individuals, should be expressed in the contracts themselves, not in limited liability by law. For if law lessened the responsibility expressed in the contract, it impaired the obligation thereof. It was impossible to regard bank charters as anything else than artifices given to certain individuals, quote, the advantage of two legal natures, one favorable for making contracts, the other favorable for avoiding the responsibility of them, end quote. Thus, Spooner laid the cause of the evils in the banking business of his time squarely on the doorsteps of the legislatures. In later writings, he was to go into great detail on the part played by the national government in placing the country's banks in the hands of a minority group. Okay? And I don't think this book is going to say it, because I'll be completely upfront and honest with you guys. I did not pre-read this. I read later on this section. I didn't pre-read because I wanted it to be a surprise to myself, even to see if this James J. Martin would even go so far as to point out who the hell was Spooner talking about. Oh my God, wouldn't you know? Yeah. Toward the end of the Constitution of No Authority, which I've read in full on this channel, Spooner is not afraid to name names because he didn't know that naming the Rothschilds as the the center of the banking crisis in this country at the time was anti-Semitic. Apparently, Spooner was a giant anti-Semite because he knew the Rothschilds were in charge of the banks at the time, and he knew that the central banks were wrong at the time, and he called out the Rothschilds for being in charge of those banks. So just noticing that like one family is in charge of a company and saying that family's wrong and that company itself is wrong and we shouldn't have that company, I guess makes you a certain type of person. Okay. Meanwhile, so in later writings, he was to go into great detail on the part played by the national government in placing the country's banks in the hands of a minority group, that minority group being the Rothschilds. Meanwhile, a personal encounter with the federal government itself occupied his attention. From 1841 to 1845, steady inroads on the revenues of the Federal Post Office Department were made by private express companies. One of these was the American Letter Mail Company, which Spooner founded in 1844. Originally carrying letters between Boston and New York, the scope of the firm soon included Philadelphia and Baltimore. It was a source of embarrassment to the Democratic administrations of the period to see this company, as well as other letter mail companies, making profits from carrying letters for 5 and 10 cents each, while providing service somewhat more expeditious than that furnished by the federal postal system. Increasing complaint by patrons over the dilatory and expensive government operations finally provoked congressional action. A bill calling for reorganization of the post office system and proposing a new schedule of rates. Excuse me. A bill calling for a reorganization of the post office system and proposing a new schedule of rates drew critical fire in the Senate from objectors who noted that private companies would still be furnishing cheaper service. Senator William D. Merrick of Maryland, sponsor of the bill, replied that there was to be no attempt at competing with these firms. They were to be put out of business by penal enactment. So basically just making it against the law. Again, Spooner went to the Constitution for support of his thesis that the passage of, I'm sorry, I keep coughing, that the passage of such legislation would be a clear transcendence of the authority granted Congress. Article 1, Section 8 merely provided that Congress might establish post offices and post roads of its own. Said he, quote, "The Constitution expresses, neither in terms nor by necessary implication, any prohibition upon the establishment of mails, post offices, and post roads by the states or individuals." End quote. and that was from the unconstitutionality of the laws of Congress prohibiting private mails. Had Congress been granted the power to establish stagecoaches and steamboats, this act would not have conferred exclusive rights to the operation and establishment of all stagecoaches and steamboat lines. The power to establish and the power to prohibit were distinct powers. And in the case of additional mail services, Congress distinctly did not have the power to prohibit. Again, that's from Private Mails. Spooner also asserted that the establishment of a government monopoly over the mails, followed by the exclusion therefrom of such materials as it cared, was actually an infringement upon the freedom of the press. This latter meant not merely the freedom of printing papers and books, but the freedom of selling and circulating them as well. This was a very important point, for without the latter, the former was of no value at all. Oh, there's a guy in the chat. Oh, hey, DF. You're a communist, question mark. No, I'm not. I'm not a communist. In fact, I don't like communists at all. So there you go. That clears that up. Channel's called Voluntaryist Academy, not communist fucking asshole place where people go to steal from each other. There, I said it. Private property for the win. Communists can go fuck themselves. Let's see here. This was a very important point, for without the latter, the former. Therefore, this selling and circulating freedom implied the right of publishers to reach buyers in any manner they choose. Or chose. All right, let's continue. Should the government be the sole carrier, it might ban publications it did not approve of. There were other considerations. Besides the social and commercial objections of slowness and costliness, Spooner advanced a moral objection to the exclusive national system. He said, its immense patronage and power used, as they always will be, corruptly, make it also a very great political evil. Competition in this pursuit would provide a reduction both in costs and time spent in delivery, as well as, quote, the political benefits of a very material purification of the government, end quote. The circulation of these ideas in a small booklet failed to be of any avail in the struggle against the government, however, and the independent companies were virtually eliminated in 1845. By a congressional act providing stiff fines for the carrying of mails by other than the government postal system. Wah, wah, wah. Spooner finally liquidated his own firm after exhausting his resources fighting the government over a 7-month period. The gradual adoption of a rate of postage similar to that charged by his company nevertheless gave him a measure of personal satisfaction. Thus ended his one experience as a businessman. He had sought to expose the wastefulness of government operation, a perennial anarchist charge, while at the same time attempting to demonstrate the merits of completely free competition. This was good anarchist economics. Up to this time, Spooner had hardly begun his work as an economic pamphleteer. Primarily concerned with money, banking, and credit, he later grew to be regarded by the anarchists as on a par with Green that's William B. Greene, as an advocate of free banking. Like Greene, he stressed the monetization of durable wealth other than specie and the opening of the business of banking to all who wished to enter it. In 1846, Spooner published another essay indicating political interference with free processes and accusing the judiciary of gross dereliction in permitting widespread violations of the laws of contracts and the principles of natural law. His writing, it's called Poverty, Its Illegal Causes and Legal Cure, set forth his basic beliefs with respect to the relation between men and the production of wealth and the reasons for the lack of harmony in these relations. The quote-unquote economical propositions he set forth to establish hinged on the proposition that it was a principle of natural law that every man was entitled to, quote-unquote, all the fruits of his own labor. Wow. Would a communist be reading that and cheering it on? That this might be feasible, it was necessary that every man be his own employer or work for himself in a direct way. Since working for another resulted in a portion being diverted to the employer. To be one's own employer, it was necessary for one to have access to one's own capital. Oh my God, there's a scary word for communists. Or to be allowed to obtain it on credit. I'm just going to make fun of communists for the rest of the night because, you know, DF came in thinking he was in a different fucking spot. And I think he left. And I'm glad. This postulated the presence of men with surplus capital to loan and a rate of interest sufficient to induce them to do so. It was to the interest of the potential self-employed laborer, however, to seek capital at the lowest possible rate of interest, and that required that free banking be allowed, implying, as a result, the monetization of many types of wealth. As the materials for banking credit are abundant. Okay, and this is from his Poverty book there. It's illegal causes, and legal cure. Spooner wrote, as the materials for banking credit are abundant, it is obvious that if free competition in banking were allowed, the rate of interest would be brought very low, and bank loans would be within the reach of everybody whose business and character should make him a reasonably safe person to loan to. This could not be, said Spooner, because of two judicial dicta upholding, quote-unquote, arbitrary and unconstitutional statutes, providing for the legalization of the banking business by the state and fixing the rate of interest, the so-called usury laws. Usury laws. Evil. They're synonyms. The first placed the granting of credit into the hands of a few. The second restricted the recipients of credit in a similar manner. It was not possible to determine an arbitrary rate of interest and expect it to operate to the best advantage of the less fortunate. Interest rates depended upon the character of the security tendered the quote-unquote capitalist in payment for the loan. The greater the degree of risk involved, the higher would be the rate of interest charged. But the standardization of a fixed rate of interest served to tie this rate of interest to the most approved security, and those unable to tender this approved security obtained no credit. The result? A violation of the right to make contracts, and the granting of a monopoly of the right of borrowing money to those few able to present the type of security deemed safest. It was a pernicious statute, warned Spooner, which allowed one man to borrow enough capital to employ 100 laborers, but which forbade the individual laborers the individual labors the facility of borrowing enough to employ themselves independently. So it's not capitalism, it's banking. Even back then. From such materials was fashioned the industrial system as well. The collection of scattered loanable capital under the control of a single bank directories and its subsequent loan to a few individuals in large sums brought about the familiar hiring pattern with quote-unquote compulsory selling of one's labor to the privileged employer. Why are they privileged? Maybe they have connections. Maybe it's something else. Thus, the usury laws, on first glance, a protection of the less fortunate from exorbitant rates of interest, but actually operating to keep them from achieving economic independence and self-employed and placing them in the mercy of a favored employing group. So just to clear that up, usury laws, usury is what you get charged to use money. Okay? And if you can't say what the money is, then the usury could be anything. And so what we have today is we have to pay back the interest on the loans from the Federal Reserve in the form of the very notes the Federal Reserve prints, but we have to pay back the interest to the Federal Reserve in the notes that they print. So you can never really pay back the debt. Ever. That's why it makes it fucking evil. That's why central banks are evil. Federal Reserve is evil. It needs to go. It's not capitalism. It's central banking. The legal structure of debts and the way that they were incurred was condemned as the other chief cause of poverty. Here again, legal construction was responsible. Spooner declared that a debt had no legal obligation, and usually no moral one, beyond the means and ability of the debtor to pay at the time the debt became due. If this principle were adopted, it would put to an end an entire class of contracts which, he said, were fraudulent and immoral from the beginning. He goes on to explain, the law requires no impossibilities from any man. If a man contract to perform what proves to be an impossibility, the contract is valid only for so much as is possible. Okay? And thus to insist on the fulfillment of a manifest impossibility was absurd. So if it's impossible, he's arguing that if it's impossible to pay back the debt, then the contract is absurd. Okay? It's fraudulent and immoral. And should be invalid. Freedom to contract for any interest rates would give creditors an opportunity to insure against the possibilities of non-payment in full by charging extra interest, almost in the nature of an insurance premium against default. This was not permitted, but the courts allowed creditors to harass the debtors indefinitely until the amount originally due was obtained. This process merely created another class tension within society without enhancing the creditor's chance of getting paid. Furthermore, as things stood, the legal structure actually was providing a type of special protection not afforded the remainder of the community. It was the responsibility of the creditor to judge for himself the capacity of the debtor before taking the risk of entrusting property to him. To grant the former permission to indefinitely pursue until satisfaction had been received amounted, in Spooner's opinion, to protection, quote, against the legitimate consequences of his own negligence, end quote. Mutual benefit was the only foundation for entry into contracts. At least the particular contract in question, quote unquote, should contemplate no injury to either party. Therefore, if the debtor had, quote, faithfully exercised his best ability for its preservation, end quote, the binding nature of this and all similar contracts was at an end when it reached the limit of the debtor's means. Extremes of wealth brought about by, quote unquote, positive legislation also underlay most crimes against property and provided the foundation for fraud and vice in general. The tendency for society to separate into, quote unquote, castes on the basis of their unequal wealth brought about most of society's diseases. Read that like dis-ease, okay? What was the influence of reform? Spooner says, legislatures, courts, prisons, churches, schools, and moral associations of all sorts are sustained at an immense cost of time, labor, talent, and money. Yet they only mitigate, they do not cure the disease. And like all efforts to cure diseases, without removing the cause, they must always be inadequate to the end in view. The causes of vice, fraud, crime, excessive wealth, and excessive poverty must be removed before society can be greatly changed. While Spooner pointed out the infringement by statute law on the right of contract, he had no formula to offer as a solution, nor any recommendation to make along positive lines. Quote, each man has the natural right to acquire all he honestly can, and to enjoy and dispose of all that he honestly acquires. In the protection of these rights is all that anyone has a right to ask of government in relation to them, end quote. This was his only concession to state interference with the economic life of the people, that each person's rights might be consistent with the equal rights of all the others. A government interfering with this formula of natural right, as they had in the matter of contracts, did so for the benefit of some at the expense of others. And in this class of action, he placed nearly all statute law applying to men's, quote unquote, pecuniary interests. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. That's a funny looking word. Pecuniary, whatever, dude. That's just, all right, let's just read what Spooner said. Nearly all the positive legislation that has ever been passed in this country, either on the part of the general or state governments, touching men's rights to labor or their rights to the fruits of their labor, has been merely an attempt to substitute arbitrary for natural laws, to abolish men's natural rights of labor, property, and contract, and in their place establish monopolies and privileges, to create extremes in both wealth and poverty, to obliterate the eternal laws of justice and right, and set up the naked will of avarice and power. In short, to rob one portion of mankind of their labor or the fruits of their labor, and give the plunder to the other portion. Are you a communist? Fuck you. These were not the words of a proletarian at the barricades, but of an established lawyer in a staid community, and they illustrate the degree of affection for natural law as well as a aversion for the legislative process and its product. The abolition or disregard of all this intricate mass of legislation and insistence by the judiciary upon the simple principles which he had outlined would suffice to bring the government into proper focus with relation to the people. It would no longer be an engine of plunder, usurpation, and tyranny. Otherwise, quote, the ignorant, the weak, and the poor, end quote, he said, would be the continual victims of the government. Spooner's research in finance resulted in his proposal in 1861 for a decentralized banking structure strikingly similar to that of Green's a dozen years before, and of Samuel Adams and the Massachusetts Land Bank Associates of 1740. Although he indicated no knowledge of either at this time, it was based on the same principle that currency should represent an investment rather than a specie dollar, and that mortgages on, quote, property of a fixed and permanent nature, end quote, were to comprise the backing. Okay? Thus, the currency would represent a certain amount of property, fulfilling Spooner's belief that sound money need not be backed by specie, but by any type of durable, tangible wealth. So instead of like a precious metal, it can just be anything. It could be, my house. Like it could be anything, really. But it had to, he's saying any type of durable, tangible wealth. So it can't be anything. It can't be like, my glass of water here, for instance. Intended for operation in local areas, the Spooner Bank plan incorporated a number of safeguards which were to provide assurance to the public that the mortgages behind the mutual money would always be ample. In the first place, the record of mortgages were to be open to public inspection. Oh, I just lost my place. Public inspection so that each individual might judge for himself as to the sufficiency of the banking. The articles of the banking association were to be circulated in a widespread manner, in which were to be reproduced copies of the mortgages and the certificates of the appraisers, whom Spooner asserted would be, quote, entitled to confidence, end quote, if they were selected from the community for their character and judgment. The amount of currency issued was to be restricted to from 1/3 to 1/2 of the total value of the real property involved in mortgages. Finally, in the Articles of Association, it was to be made plain that all mortgages were to be made mutually responsible for each other. An insufficient mortgage had to be made good by the banking company. The effect of this provision was expected to make the bank founders examine each other's mortgages carefully and thus guarantee the integrity of all, since no one would wish to put in a good mortgage in the knowledge that one or more worthless ones were also entered. Freedom from fraudulent appraisal was essential, therefore making it necessary that free access to the records be provided to all for scrutiny at their pleasure. A sound mutual banking system would be provided when those who were to use the currency had the opportunity to know fully by what it was backed and by whom the mortgages which it represented had been appraised. Thus, a democratic type of certification, said Spooner, would replace certification by one man or by agents of the state. Spooner advanced much the same arguments for his bank as had Green. It would furnish a stable, abundant currency with a low interest rate guaranteed by competition and limited only by the amount of real property, which was exceedingly more plentiful than specie. The amount of real property exceedingly more than the amount of gold or silver, right? It would break up the monopoly of money by opening its possession to all who had something to mortgage. It would distribute credit equally through the community, and by its abundance would bring about cash payments universally. It would diversify industry by affording credit for engaging in the production of new commodities as fast as they were invented. adhering to his long-held premise that the state governments had no constitutional power whatever to prohibit any kind of banking which was naturally just and lawful, quote unquote. He maintained that the system could be introduced lawfully and at the same time bypass chartering or special legislation. The arrangement of the association in the form of a stock company put in the category with all other kinds of businesses. The very fact that the conventional banking system required so much special legislation in its favor and the large volume of surveillance necessary thereafter was sufficient evidence, charged Spooner, that it was naturally vicious and deserved abolition. Spooner's, he wrote, new system of paper currency attracted the attention of Amasa Walker, who was one of the nation's outstanding financial conservatives. Walker questioned Spooner's standing as an exponent of finance, but admitted his plan was an honest one, with no element of fraud or deception in its makeup. He noted also its similarity to that of Green's, but concluded with finality that neither would ever succeed. Spooner, who designated Walker as, quote, the highest authority in the country in opposition to all paper currency that does not represent gold and silver actually on hand, end quote, considered his objections beside the point, and was incensed and bitter at the condemnation received from such high conservative quarters. He expected the Economist to oppose any type of paper which represented property other than coin, even though of equal market value. But what was particularly irking was to find himself compared with John Law. This notorious 18th century speculator had made no attempt to make his notes redeemable. It was pointed out, while the currency issued under his plan was backed by double its face value mortgages on property which were appraised in terms of their values in gold dollars. Okay. And so let's read this footnote, number 42. The property that is represented by the paper, and which constitutes the real money, is just as real substantial property as is gold or silver, or any other money or property whatever. And it is really an incorrect and false use of the term to call such money paper money, as if the paper itself were the real money, or as if there were no money and no value outside of the paper. A dollar's worth of land, wheat, iron, wool, or leather is just as much a dollar in real value as is a dollar of gold or silver. And when represented by paper, it is just as real money, as far as value is concerned, as is gold or silver. And that was written by Spooner in something called the Gold and Silver as Standards of Value, published in Radical Review, Volume 1, page 765. This article was later translated and reprinted in the French language, Costa Rican anarchist periodical Lysander, 1 of October, 1927. Anyways, Spooner introduced his bank project twice more, in 1864 and 1873, at which times federal activity in finance drew his excoriation. His mastery of vituperation. Let's look up what that. I want to look up what that word means right now. I have never in my life. This is why I should pre-read these, but I don't. Sorry, guys. This is not very. This is entertaining, I think. I don't know. What do you spell that? Vitu. I've never even seen that word in my entire life. vituperation. Vituperation. Oh, maybe that's it. Vituperation. Whatever. Vituperation became, and what does it mean? Oh yeah. The act or instance of vituperating. Because it has the ION at the end. Sustained, harshly critical language. Invective. All right, so his mastery of vituperation became evident as he marshaled objections to the growth of practices and policies which benefited a narrowing minority. Two of the prominent measures by which the administration financed the Civil War, the Legal Tender Acts, and the National Banking Act, came under especially bitter fire. He condemned the Legal Tender Acts as clearly unconstitutional on 2 counts. 1, for interfering with the right of contract, and 2, for exceeding the grant of power to Congress. Congress was delegated nowhere in the Constitution to provide a national currency or to establish a legal tender which everyone was under obligation to accept and use in the contraction and payment of debts. The power to coin money and to regulate its value did not include the power to make its use universal and mandatory. Interesting. The parties to a contract alone had the power to fix the tender. What the debtor agreed to pay and the creditor to receive was the legal tender, and Congress had no authority to alter this arrangement. Parties had no legal obligation to make their contracts payable in coin. They are at perfect liberty to make them payable in wheat, corn, hay, iron, wool, cotton, pork, beef, or anything else they choose. End quote. The real purpose in coining money and establishing it as a legal tender was not to force it upon parties to contracts, but to provide commodities whose qualities and quantities might be precisely ascertained, and which would be available for use by all who cared to do so. Congress did not make its money legal tender. The persons who used it as such made it so. To assert that Congress could fix the tender and payment of a debt in a manner which made it independent of the agreement of the parties concerned was to establish the power of Congress to make part of the contract, and that they clearly did not possess. Thus, he concluded, the general government was exceeding its commission in and infringing on the right of contract by forcing into circulation its own currency and that of the banks it chose to authorize, to the exclusion of all others. The National Banking Act of February 25th of 1863 was also a governmental creature in the interests of a privileged group. Congress had no more power to guarantee the notes of bankers than it had those of farmers, workers, or merchants, nor to print their banknotes any more than to furnish their physical properties or pay the bank officers' salaries. Congressional protection of private banks from liability for debts because they were at the same time engaged in performing services to the government also came under fire. The section of the act imposing a 10% tax upon all bills in circulation not authorized by Congress was declared even more reprehensible, especially in its potentialities for by an extension of this principle. He saw nothing in the way of bringing the entire industry and commerce of the land under arbitrary control of congressional favorites. The appearance of what's called a new banking system in 1873 was not a response to the financial panic of that year. Again, a financial panic, okay? Banks are running out of money, inflation, whatever. But to this, so the financial panic of that year, but to the serious fire which devastated part of Spooner's adopted home city of Boston. He proposed that a plan be adopted to help rebuild by making use of the large reservoir of loanable capital in the form of real property in the state, and brought out once more his now familiar arguments in favor of the decentralized mutual banking scheme. Interwoven among the outlines were new blasts at government control of finance, pointing up evils which he painted in lurid shades and with tendencies toward overstatement laid directly at the door of the Banking Act of a decade before. It pained Spooner to hear constantly of the national banking system in tones which suggested a huge impersonal mechanism divorced from humanity and clothed with awesome characteristics. He went to the opposite extreme in denouncing the entire structure as palpably private in all respects and worthy of little reverence. The legal person known as a bank, Spooner defined as a group of about 50 people, the actual lenders of money. It was his estimate that in a nation of nearly 40 millions, some 100,000 controlled all credit and thus exercised similar power over the nation's property and labor. Okay, he goes on to say, the quote-unquote national system, so-called, is in reality no national system at all, except in the mere fact that it is called the national system and was established by the national government. It is, in truth, only a private system, a mere privilege conferred upon a few, to enable them to control prices, property, and labor, and thus swindle, plunder, and oppress all the rest of the people. Sound familiar? Again, this is what? He's talking 1873. Wait, 1873? He's not talking about... No way. He's not talking about 1913? Or 2025? Spooner recited the catalog of objectionable consequences, which included not only the limited supply of loanable capital, but the accompanying high rates of interest. American manufacturers borrowed from the banks and then passed the high interest rates on to the ultimate consumers of their products. They could do so safely because the scarcity of money capital would preclude competitive action, while the tariff walls would effectively restrain foreign competition to a minimum. The return to specie payments, in view of this situation, he charged, was a false issue. For the real purpose behind the hard money argument was to make credit even harder to obtain and thus ensure the continued oligarchical control of the national financial structure. Spooners, our financiers, their ignorance, usurpations, and frauds, which first appeared in Tucker's, that's Benjamin Tucker's, Radical Review in 1877, summarized most of his previous stands, in which he attacked the federal government as the real power upholding a privileged banking system, protesting the prohibition by the government through taxation of any other than its own money, and the mass of regulatory and licensing legislation attending the entry into the banking business. He now mustered his choicest polemics for an attack upon the nation's financiers and their part in encouraging monopoly in business and industry. This was now inevitable in view of the increasing centralization of finance. Spooner says the establishment of a monopoly of money is equivalent to the establishment of monopolies in all the businesses that are carried on by means of money. He goes on to insist, equivalent to a prohibition upon all business except such as the monopolists of money may choose to license. Okay. Through possessing the power of denying credit. For over 20 years after Spooner's death, the pages of Tucker's Liberty were to propagate this declaration, the money monopoly becoming the bête noire and Tucker's critical evaluation of maturing American capitalism. All right, so Dissident Among Dissidents, Part 2. The evolution of Lysander Spooner's philosophy to that of unalloyed anti-statism cannot be adequately observed through an examination of his economic thought alone. A long series of political writings paralleled his others. Through these runs the thread of persistent concern over the concepts of natural law, natural justice, and natural rights, which eventually led him to denounce all man-made government as superfluous and the legislative process as pure chicanery. In two small books titled The Unconstitutionality of Slavery, the first of which appeared in 1845, he advanced interpretations of law, justice, and government which became basic premises for his attack upon statute law and the nature and functions of the institutions of majority rule. He was not yet a confirmed anti-statist, and his preoccupation in these essays was not with the authority of the Constitution, but with its interpretation. He criticized Wendell Phillips and William Lloyd Garrison as guilty of grave inconsistency for holding the Constitution to be a slavery-supporting document. It was as an independent slavery-hating lawyer, and not as an active participant in political abolitionism, that Spooner wrote these works, however. Despite, they mentioned William Lloyd Garrison again. From my hometown, what's up? There's an inn in my hometown called the Garrison Inn, and it's named after William Lloyd Garrison. Whoop, whoop. I personally take great pride that I'm from the same area as these guys. You know, like it's great. I mean, Massachusetts these days is kind of a hellhole, but the rich history, there's something that, I don't know, it's like there's something in the ground, you know, like there's something in the air. I hate it. I mean, yeah, we're getting sprayed like bugs and they put fluoride in the water these days, but like there's something really special about it, you know. I think so. I mean, how many of these guys are from Massachusetts? Like almost all of them. It's great. Anywho, where were we? All right, so we're talking about Spooner. He hates slavery, which is great because I do too. Despite extended relations with Garrett Smith and the fact that some of his writings became Liberty Party campaign materials in the late 1840s, there is no evidence of his membership in the party at any time, nor of political affiliation with Smith. His books are important for an entirely different reason than as contributions to the literature of the anti-slavery movement. So Spooner was unsatisfied with the use of the word law, except when defined as, quote, an intelligible principle of right, end quote, which existed in the nature of man and things. It of necessity had to be a permanent, universal, and inflexible rule, incapable of being established, quote, by mere will, numbers, or power, end quote. If this was the case, then natural law was paramount to whatever rules of conduct might be established by man acting alone or in groups. If this was the case, then natural law was paramount, most important. That's what paramount means. More important than the rest, to whatever rules of conduct might be established by man acting alone or in groups. Take that, fucking moral relativists out there, you statist swine. Spooner goes on to say, there is and can be correctly speaking, no law but natural law. There is and can be, correctly speaking, no law but natural law. In later writings, he was to define natural law as the science of men's rights, which were in their possession as such strictly on their standing as individuals, meaning because they are alive. There were no such things as group rights, declared Spooner. He said, society is only a number of individuals. What a fucking moron. Kidding. Looking about him, he had to admit, nevertheless, that the definition which had come to be universally adopted was not that of the principle of natural justice, but that of statute or decree. This later he conceded to be nothing but the prescriptions of what he called self-styled governments who have no other title to the prerogative of establishing such rules than is given them by the possession or command of sufficient physical power to coerce submission to them. I have a big stick. Do what I say, or I will hit you with it. That's a logical fallacy called, I think it's called ad baculum, if I'm remembering correctly, and that's exactly what it is. Do as I say, or I'm gonna fuck you up. This he condemned as an undisguised corruption of the term law, okay, which achieved dignity among the general populace because of the latter's blind veneration for physical power. Such tacit approval of crime masquerading as law suggested to him an earlier age of human life when other type of superstition had, quote, allowed falsehood, absurdity, and cruelty to usurp the name and throne of religion, end quote. Taking up Noah Webster's definition of municipal law, which appeared to be the generally understood as sufficient to cover all usages in ordinary life, Spooner engaged in a structural analysis of it clause by clause, with the intent of demonstrating that it was in reality a shield for reprehensible behavior. He took particular exception to the phrase "supreme power of the state" as the evident source of the status of law. This expression apparently meant force in its largest concentration, which might be in the person or persons of one or several men. This rendered the principle of law extremely uncertain and, in cases of wide dispersal of power through various factions, actually served to nullify it. If law stemmed from the physical force requisite to obtain obedience thereto, then there was no real distinction between law and force, a condition which deprived it of all quote-unquote moral character and rendered it exceptionally unpalatable to a considerable audience. Another implication of this definition, said Spooner, was that a command to commit an injustice was as legal as a commission to perform justice, as long as it emanated from a source sufficiently strong to effect coercion. If the concept of quote-unquote law was unsatisfactorily vague and impermanent, that of the state, quote-unquote state, was even more so. Politically and sociologically, there appeared nothing fixed in its nature, character, or boundaries. Again, it was the quote-unquote will and power of individuals which determined its establishment, and perpetually subject to abolition and or incorporation within that of another, if overcome by individuals of great strength or greater strength. He says a quote-unquote state is simply the boundaries within which any single combination or concentration of will and power are efficient or irresistible for the time being, end quote. And that was from Unconstitutionality in 1845. Natural law, which recognized the validity of contracts, quote, which men have a natural right to make, end quote, permitted the foundation of government on this basis, but only if the contract was that of an association of individuals, entered into consciously and voluntarily by each as an individual. This governmental contract might authorize means such as statutes, quote, not inconsistent with natural justice for the better protection of men's natural rights, end quote. But under no conditions might it sanction the destruction of natural rights while ostensibly acting in a manner which might be interpreted as furthering them. Spooner writes, if the majority, however large, of the people enter into a contract of government called a constitution by which they agree to aid, abet, or accomplish any kind of injustice, or to destroy or invade the natural rights of any person or persons whatsoever, this contract of government is unlawful and void. It confers no rightful authority upon those appointed to administer it. It confers no rightful authority upon those appointed to administer it. The only duties which anyone can owe to it or to the government established under cover of its authority are disobedience, resistance, destruction. The idea that there was any inherent authority or sovereignty in a government as such Spooner scouted as an imposture, as he also did the belief in the right of a majority to restrain individuals from quote-unquote exercise of natural rights through the utility of quote-unquote arbitrary enactments. These doctrines he placed in the same category as that of a divine right of kings. Judicial tribunals were bound to declare the government or the majority acting in an illegal capacity whenever involved in promoting anything which subverted natural law and its underlying principle, natural justice, which he defined in one place as, quote-unquote, the rendering of equivalence. Wendell Phillips' reaction to Spooner's political philosophy, apart from his position in the constitutional status of slavery, produced a number of expected categorical rejections, but none more strong than dealing with the duty of the judiciary. The purpose of a civil government of necessity required that the majority decide what is law, he said. That's Wendell Phillips. That's what he said. Under Spooner's conception, not only was it an impossibility to conceive of quote-unquote regular government, but its adoption was, quote, the first step toward anarchy, end quote. In view of the fact that this latter term was not yet used in its scientific concept, the remark had a prophetic quality. In considering the extremity to which Spooner's logic carried him 20 years later, it was Phillips' idea that people were bound to obey all legislative statutes, however unjust, until the body responsible for their passage arrived at their repeal. He did admit that revolution was a proper step in opposition to the quote-unquote bad laws of the state, but that the laws remained on the statute books and that judges were bound to enforce them until necessity was removed by the occurrence of a revolt. In some ways, the discussion tended to concern two different things, which at times was more or less admitted. Phillips said, Mr. Spooner is at liberty to say that much of what the world calls law is not obligatory because it is not just. But to assert that because a thing is not right, it is but to assert that because a thing is not right, it is not law, as that term is commonly and rightfully used, is entering into the question of what constitutes the basis of government among men. But Spooner pointed out that as a consequence of this belief, it would be impossible to distinguish between constitutional and unconstitutional laws in the conventional sense, since those that were constitutional were binding only until repealed. This would therefore give illegal statutes the same status as the legal, and end by canceling out the Constitution and substituting the unlimited power of the government. Furthermore, while waiting for the repeal of a hateful enactment, the government might take such steps in the curtailment of civil rights and the interruption of suffrage as to put it beyond popular power to have any effect in righting the evil condition. Where his previous theorizing had been confined primarily with an evaluation of the state as a political organism stemming from origins laid in force, with its effectiveness depending on the application of still more force when functioning through a government, Spooner now took up the matter of the composition of government. Aiming to neutralize Phillips' constant dwelling upon law and government as reflections of the majority will, he undertook the precipitate the majestic conception along lines of his own. Looking at the United States Constitution, he declared that the convention delegates represented only 1/20th of the whole population in the country, and that statutory legislation was produced by men who represented only half of that number. In view of the fact that voters chose a particular representative on the basis of his views on a limited number of quote-unquote topics, this person was required to legislate on hundreds of others. Therefore, on such occasions, he represented no one but himself. Oh my God. He charged constitutional and statutory law were, quote, manufactured in a ridiculous and fraudulent manner, end quote. And especially so when they invaded or destroyed, quote, the natural rights of large bodies of the people, end quote. The judges who presided over their enforcement he considered hardly above the level of, quote unquote, felons. This attack upon representative government he incorporated almost intact in avowedly anarchist writings after the Civil War. Its inclusion in an anti-slavery pamphlet obviously intended to defend the Constitution from charges of being a slavery-protecting document indicates the direction of his thought. The Spooner of 1887 was hardly more an anarchist than the Spooner of 1847. By 1852, his attack upon government entered a new phase with the publication of an essay on the trial by Jerry. This was a heavily documented book which undertook to supply a radical revisionist study of this institution and its place in the state of his time. It was still being reprinted in an abridged form by the radical press as late as 1912. The work had for its core the thesis that any legislation either in England or the United States which was in conflict with the common law was summarily invalid. Its subject matter was the evolution of trial by jury from the times of Magna Carta. Why is it spelled like that? Times of Magna Carta Charta? Anyways, to the I know it's Magna Carta, from the mid-19th century and its transformation into a piece of machinery of the state. Threw me off there. In establishing his objections, he made known that it was his understanding that juries in criminal cases over this long period of time were established to function in 4 specific capacities. There had been, quote, no clear principle of English or American constitutional law, end quote. Then the recognized role of the jury in judging the facts of the case, what the law was, and the quote unquote moral intent of the accused. But a fourth, though rarely mentioned mission remained, their primary and paramount duty, end quote. He goes on to say, to judge of the justice of the law and to hold all laws invalid that are in their opinion unjust or oppressive, and all persons guiltless in violating or resisting the execution of such laws. Okay? Trial by jury, declared Spooner, indicated a fundamental attitude among Anglo-Saxon people toward their institutions, a distrust of the government. That's an interesting point. I never looked at it that way, but good. Okay. This was reflected in the numerous impediments placed in the way of unrestrained exercise of power by a few, which the governmental conceptions made feasible and inviting. Unsatisfied by the machinery of obstruction placed within the governmental structure itself, another restraint on the exercise of power was reserved for erection outside it, this being the trial by jury. This, he said, was a trial, quote, by the country, end quote, in contradistinction to a governmental tribunal. Its ideal objective was to define and locate popular liberties against the government rather than allowing the government to set its own limits of operation. It was an impossibility for the people to have any liberties apart from those graciously granted them by the government, unless they were allowed to determine the nature of them through a process free from any degree of governmental interference. On one particular matter, Spooner was emphatic, and that was on defining the term jury and interpreting its origin. It was a technical term, he insisted, derived from the common law. Hence, when the American constitutions, federal or state, provided for the jury trial, it was in the spirit of the common law that this tribunal was to be constructed, and not merely a facsimile which the government chose to devise in its image. In other words, it was the quote-unquote thing and not the quote-unquote name which was to be provided, thus making it obligatory that jury selection be made according to common law principles. Of these, 2 were absolutely essential. Number 1, in the particular geographical area in question, all the adults were eligible for selection thereon. And number 2, when the time of actual selection for any particular case was at hand, it should take place in such manner as to bar all possibility of its choice by the government or governmental interference in the selection. Any legislation which infringed on these 2 principles was unconstitutional. He said that it's unconstitutional. Therefore, and the judgments of juries which owed their existence to such special circumstances were absolutely void, since trial by jury had been abolished by the first intrusion of the government into such affairs. Spooner charged that in the England and United States of his time, there existed sufficient evidence that the quote-unquote true trial by jury did not exist at all, nor had it done so for many years. In England, the establishment of property qualifications restricted the selection to less than the whole, and illegality exceeded only by the removal from the people of the right of selecting the sheriffs. Formerly popular officials in charge of selection of juries. Now, said Spooner, they were little more than the king's tools, and allowed for virtual selection by the king of such juries as he might wish. In the United States, things were hardly any better. He declared that there was no state in which all the names of adult males living within its bounds were placed in a box for jury selection. The fact that jurors were selected by sheriffs who owed their appointments to state governors, or by county court, or by county court judges and clerks of circuit or county courts. What is it about county courts? It makes me want to say country. I'm having fun tonight. I'm glad to be back on live streams and covering this material. And Lysander Spooner was a great man. I have a Lysander Spooner trading card over there on the wall. I wish I had my book cam set up. I would show you guys. Okay. Let's maybe I'll edit this in post. The fact that jurors were selected by sheriffs who owed their appointments to state governors, or by county court judges and clerks of circuit or county courts, was conclusive proof of the illegality of the operation of the system in this country. On the basis of common law criteria, he believed that there never had been a single legal jury trial in the history of the country since the adoption of the Constitution. Hence, juries were of no use in controlling the government or preserving popular liberties. Nor was this all, protested Spooner. Spooner goes on to say, if the real trial by jury had been preserved in the courts of the United States, that is, if we had legal juries, and the jurors had known their rights, it is hardly probable that 1/10 of the past legislation of Congress would ever have been enacted, or at least that, if enacted, it could never have been enforced. Later anarchist hatred of legislation carried no more implications than did this. His proposal included 2 specific recommendations for rectifying this trend away from popular control. First, he proposed appointment of jurors from the names of all adult males contained in a common jury box for the area regardless of the size of the unit, without those chosen learning that fact from the officials designated to select. Secondly, and also in line with common law conceptions as he saw them, all judges presiding over juries in criminal trials should of necessity be chosen by the people and not appointed by the government acting in either its executive or legislative capacity. Spooner had other things in mind besides the guaranteeing of fairness to any particular individual seeking justice through the jury trial system. He was convinced that a jury obtained in such a way as to preclude the possibility of the government learning its composition made it exceedingly difficult for the government to pack it with its partisans. Therefore, the jury veto was a much sounder guarantee against the perpetuation of unjust and oppressive laws than reliance upon repeal by a succeeding legislature brought into power by the exercise of the franchise. Spooner said, or wrote, in Trial by Jury, as unanimity as unanimity is required for a conviction, it follows that no one can be convicted except for the violation of such laws as substantially the whole country wish to have maintained. The government can enforce none of its laws by punishing offenders through the verdicts of its juries, except such as substantially the whole people wish to have enforced. Spooner, obsessed with the importance of the struggle for preservation of minority rights, felt that at best the quote-unquote government was a portion or quote-unquote faction of the people interested in the support of its program. The legislators involved were irresponsible during the period for which they were elected, generally free from fear of removal and neither accountable nor punishable when their term in office had elapsed. Hope of a greater degree of honesty on the part of a succeeding legislature was not sound. If the group they were elected to replace could be proved to have been elected for motives of injustice, it merely demonstrated that a portion of society had desired to establish injustice and might succeed in more effective manner at a subsequent date. Change was no guarantee of betterment. It might even result in a worsening of conditions. A government that could enforce its laws for one day without making recourse to the whole people directly or through one of its representative tribunals was an absolute government. Trial by jury served the function of demanding that the government obtain its consent before punishing the violators of the laws it passed. It was the further supposition that 12 men chosen by lot from the mass of the people constituted a more representative cross-section of the country than any group representing, quote-unquote, the government. Trial by jury gave to anyone the freedom of choice to violate any of the government's laws. Should such individual be willing to allow the jury to decide whether the law broken was a just one. Should even a reasonable doubt exist as to the justice of the law, the benefit of such doubt should be given to the defendant and not to the government. In one sense, said Spooner, trial by jury was a formal establishment of the right of government. Superior to the, let's see. In one sense, said Spooner, trial by jury was a formal establishment of the right of revolution, which no government ever willingly acknowledged. Okay, so government never admitted the injustice of its laws, and revolt was possible only by such elements as actually established a degree of physical strength superior to the government. If they should prove unsuccessful, regardless of the justifiability of the rebellion, they were always subject to punishment for treason. Trial by jury, in the sense in which he was speaking of, it was the only real support for this, quote, right of resistance, end quote. Okay, so I wanted to read that again. Okay. So in one sense, said Spooner, trial by jury was a formal establishment of the right of revolution, which no government ever willingly acknowledged. Okay. What does that mean? So what we're talking about here is like hung juries, jury nullification. We're talking about, it has to be, everyone on the jury has to convict, unanimous, and the voting has to be unanimous. And if one person dissents, then, it becomes harder for that person to be convicted of the crime. This is a form of like civil revolution, right? Where the courts would have a very difficult time convicting anybody. Government never admitted the injustices of its laws, and revolt was possible only by such elements as actually established a degree of physical strength superior to the government. If they should prove unsuccessful, regardless of the justifiability of the rebellion, they were always subject to punishment for treason, since the government in power alone judged the nature of treason. Okay? Trial by jury, in the sense in which he was speaking of, was the only real support for this right of resistance. Constitutions were no effective limit to the power of the government. If those in power felt that the people would not compel them to remain within its restrictions. This is extremely important. This is extremely important because this is what we're dealing with right now. And we'll get, I'm sure the quote is in this book. It would be a damn shame if it's not. But Spooner says in the Constitution of No Authority that that one of two things is true about the Constitution of the United States of America. That either it has granted the power to the government to become the tyrannical government that it's become, or the Constitution has been powerless to stop it. This is evergreen, and he's talking about it back in like 1870s, 1860s. There are recordings on this channel right now of the Constitution of No Authority and his essay on natural law. I suggest you look into those next after this. Constitutions were no effective limit to the power of the government if those in power felt that the people would not compel them to remain within its restrictions. It's up to us if we want to have a constitutional republic government. It would be up to the people to enforce it. It's not the government. You can't trust the government. Even if you want government, you can't trust them. Don't trust government ever. Even if you want them around, even if they are what some people so cynically call a necessary evil. I don't subscribe to that notion, but some people do. Okay, let's make believe. Let's use our little imaginations here and pretend. Let's go to make believe town and make believe that, yeah, it's a necessary evil, which it's not, but we're pretending here. It would be up to us to compel them to stick to the rules that were put in front of them and say, the Constitution is there to say, here's the things the government of the United States is not allowed to do. Here's the rights of the people that they are charged with preserving. And the only thing that's going to compel them to keep their word is us holding them to account. And for generations now in this country, no one has held them to account. And it's gotten so bad that the only thing that can even be done is a tiny blip on the radar, such as myself, or even bigger blips on the radar, such as Mark Passio or Larkin Rose or Richard Grove or many other respectable people out there trying to enlighten people to the fact that we are being robbed and cheated by our government, and that the Constitution might mean something. Personally, I don't know if it does. There There are many people out there that are trying to get back to this idea. And so, but what can we do? We can just speak out. That's pretty much all we can do. There is no, at this time, no we fight with better ideas. That's what we do. We certainly don't become communists. Okay, so let's get this going, because we only got a little bit left. If the people are as good as their word, they may keep the government within the bounds they have set for it. Otherwise, it will disregard them. Granted the existence of a jury trial system, which still remained in complete popular control, resistance to the governmental overbearing was thus made available, and neutralization of quote-unquote tyrannical legislation made possible without recourse to violence. I gotta step away for just a second. I'll be right back. Give me 10 seconds. All right. Spooner dismissed the argument that the government was an instrument created by the people for the purpose of furthering their own interests, and that to allow the jury, a popularly chosen and representative body, to invalidate acts of the government was to pit the people against themselves. He pointed out that regardless of the degree of faith and the impartiality of the government existing among the people as a whole, there already were a number of tribunals before which acts of the government were required to undergo review. To add the jury to both houses of the national legislature, the president, and the judges of the federal court system was no significant deviation. In his mind, the real issue was even more basic than this. It was imperative that the jury once more be installed in its previous position of theoretical dominance to preserve the small amount of political liberty wrung from past despotisms. The divine right of kings, he said, was fast giving place, quote unquote, fast giving place to another fetish. The belief that in a given area, the larger number of the people had a right to govern the smaller. Granted, the majority rule might be less onerous than rule by a single tyrant, still the principle was no more true. Quote, obviously there is nothing in the nature of majorities that ensures justice at their hands, end quote, he declared. They had the same frailties as minorities and had no qualities which made it evident that they were immune from acting in an oppressive manner. The question of right remained far above the matter of political tactics, and was no more determined in a situation where two men ruled one than where one man ruled two. To take for granted the coincidence of justice and majority will, he warned, quote, is only another form of the doctrine that might makes right, end quote. It's actually the other way around. Right makes might. That's some Richard Wetherell for you. Do right or go wrong. Anyways, another implication stemmed from the assumption of the virtuousness of majority rule. Minorities had no rights in the government. This was a necessary concomitant. Another word. Two words in one episode that I've just never seen before in my life. Concomitant. A necessary concomitant. In view, let's look up, what does that word mean? Concomitant. 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 A thing that is conjoined or concurrent with another, an accompaniment, an accessory, an associated thing, quality, or circumstance. A person who accompanies another, an attendant or companion. Concomitant. Concomitant. That's how you pronounce it. Okay. This was a necessary concomitant in view of the fact that the majority determined what rights the minority were to enjoy without hindrance from the latter. This was an intolerable situation. The minority should have at least one weapon available unqualifiedly at its disposal. Spooner writes in Trial by Jury. This is page 214 through 215 or something like that. It is indispensable to a free government that the minority, the weaker party, have a veto upon the acts of the majority. Political liberty is liberty for the weaker party in a nation. It is only the weaker party that it is only the weaker party that lose their liberties when a government becomes oppressive. The stronger party in all governments are free by virtue of their superior strength. They never oppress themselves. Legislation is the work of the stronger party, and if they have the sole power of determining what legislation shall be enforced, they have all power in their hands. And the weaker party are the subjects of an absolute government. Nor would Spooner, hold on. I'm getting an alert on the stream. Hold on one second. See what it says. I don't want to. God damn it. It's fine. Whatever. We'll go. Nor would Spooner countenance majority rule on the basis of the argument that the side of superior numerical strength was a more or less valid indication of probability of being, quote unquote, right. The, quote, lives, liberties, and properties of men, end quote, were of too great esteem to risk them to possible destruction, unless the action in which men engaged was based on, quote, certainty beyond a reasonable doubt, end quote. And this was ensured only by the unanimity which the jury principle made obligatory. In one sense, this process enabled the minority to, quote unquote, defeat the will of the majority, but only in a negative capacity. No possibility of passage of laws by the minority existed. The refusal to back laws which they found undesirable to themselves was all that the trial by jury might reinforce, at best. Such was the gist of Spooner's plea on behalf of the reinstatement of the principle. I clicked away from the. Yeah, such was the gist of Spooner's plea on behalf of the reinstatement of a system of trial by jury which confirmed anti-statists of a later generation, as well as Spooner himself during his last years. Viewed as the only sure protection from governmental oppression short of violent revolutionary action. Trial by jury also marked the end of his political writing, which retained any noticeable element of restraint. In a series of pamphlets titled No Treason, he compounded an attack on the conduct of the war, the Republican Party, and eventually the entire structure of the political democracy. While the earliest of the series reflected in part the disillusionment of a portion of the intellectual fringe of the New England anti-slavery element, and dwelt at some length upon the material consequences of the war, the last developed into an attack upon the institutional state and the United States Constitution, which surpassed in extremity and daring any similar document written and published by a Native American, small n. Many of the arguments and much of the spirit of No Treason were revived 15 years later, when a fully developed anarchist press was in full bloom. Spooner's anti-government sentiments were thoroughly aroused by boasting on the part of elements of the North over the crushing of Southern dissent in the name of liberty and free government. He said it resembled a holy war fought in the interests of establishing a state religion, and in actuality took the form of a repudiation of government by consent. The idea of a government by consent implied an important implied an important principle. Consent from each individual person who was required to furnish support to the government either through the paying of taxes or supplying some type of personal service. Without this, it must be admitted that the government in question is not founded on consent at all. To obtain the consent of only so many as was necessary to obtain control over the remainder was not establishing a government by consent. Rather, it was the fruition of, quote, a mere conspiracy of the strong against the weak. Consent could not be presumed in any case whatsoever, despite the prevailing tendencies of governments to do so. Spooner held that the surest sign that a government was not, quote-unquote, free was the prevalence of coercion in securing support of any number of persons, no matter how small. There is no criterion, he charged, by which to determine whether a government is a free one or not, than the single one of its depending or not depending solely on voluntary support. Having expressed his conception of the anarchist foundation of society, the voluntary organization through free association, he went on to hammer away at the orthodox understanding of government by consent and the sensitive problem of treason. He considered the South, quote, equally erroneous, end quote, with the North concerning allegiance. The latter, he claimed, insisted that each individual was held in allegiance to the federal government, and the former similarly claimed such adherence was due the state government. Spooner disavowed the owing of involuntary allegiance on the part of the individual to either of these political structures. The very word allegiance itself appeared nowhere in the Constitution, and even that says past tense. It doesn't say it anywhere even present, in present tense, nor did any similar word implying the existence of such services as fidelity or obedience to the government occur in the document. Okay? So allegiance, and there's nothing implying the existence of services, the existence of such services as fidelity or obedience to the government. That doesn't occur in the Constitution either. It says nothing about that in the Constitution. I have a copy of it on the shelf behind me. All right. His examination of the preamble to the Constitution convinced him that the latter, quote, professes to rest wholly on consent, end quote, and that any material relation or spiritual attitude toward the government on the part of the individual persons stemmed wholly from this condition of consent. Duty or obligation were not a part of this matter, nor could either be so at a later time. In addition to this, several facts convinced him that at best the Constitution could not be construed in any sense but that of an association during pleasure. That's what he called it, an association during pleasure, quote unquote. Those who made it had no power to contract for others than themselves in political or any other matters. Okay. To maintain that a group of men might make political agreements binding on future generations was as valid as to believe that they possessed the power to make business or marriage contracts mandatory upon them. In the case of those who adopted the Constitution, no evidence existed to indicate the period of time for which they pledged their support. Hence, the original parties to this article of government were, at most, bound for no longer than the period during which they cared to give their support, and certainly for no longer a time than their own lifespan. Spooner insisted that if the Constitution was to be considered the work of individual persons, there was, quote unquote, no escape from such conclusions as these. Viewed in this light, the issue of treason also underwent a qualification through definition. Governments not founded upon the principle of, quote unquote, consent assumed the unwavering fidelity of all people living under them, and were inclined to view all resistors as treasonous. This was the addiction of the absolutist, said Spooner, and was a, quote, false and, a false and calumnious application. Treason properly designated meant only treacherous or deceitful conduct resulting in a willful breach of faith. An open enemy in the act of rebellion could not be construed a traitor under any stretching of the meaning of the word. For this reason, he dismissed the heated northern sentiment that leaned toward wholesale indictment of the South on this charge. Treason rested in the entire case upon the supposition that the accused person had at one time granted his consent and had subsequently acted in an unfaithful manner. Unless prior consent could be proved against the person involved in treachery accusations, the case could not stand, since it was impossible to be treasonous to a government if support to it had never been voluntarily yielded. Such tightly wired theoretical arguments filled much of the no treason pamphlets. Indulgence in personalities and specific citations was not prominent until the final number of the series appeared in 1870. In this, he flatly rejected the entire Constitution and all the political usages that had grown under it throughout its existence, after a quarter century of writing about the problem created by its devious interpretation. It is true that in view of his doctrine of individual voluntary consent, he had long been dubious of the process of adoption due to the bypassing of the women, children, Negroes. This is 1952, okay? It says Negroes. Just reading here. In a large percentage of the nation's white adult males through state property qualifications. Now I wish I didn't even say anything about it. Whatever, though. I could have improvised, I guess. Now his opposition was summary in nature. He was convinced that the instruments of government were being utilized almost wholly in the interests of a few favored segments of the population. Written in a provoking and inflammatory style, midway during the Reconstruction period, its sentiment was transmitted almost intact to a later time when conscious anarchists absorbed it into their propaganda. Spooner recited his argument that the Constitution possessed no authority of itself, and that it merely represented a contract drawn up among persons now long dead, even though relatively few persons then living had been allowed to take formal part in expressing either approval or dissent at the time of its adoption. He denied the possibility of legally establishing its binding character upon generations since that time. Quote, "There is in the Constitution nothing that professes or attempts to bind the quote unquote posterity of those who establish it, end quote. To assume as much amounted to making people the slaves of their foolish, tyrannical, and dead grandfathers, end quote. And that's directly from No Treason. That's footnote number 108 in this chapter. And so this is from No Treason, number 6. Nearly half a century before, Thomas Jefferson declared, quote, "Can one generation bind another in succession forever? I think not. Rights and powers can only belong to persons, not to things. When it has disappeared, another majority is in..." I'm sorry. Wait, I lost my place. Not the things. "A generation may bind itself as long as its majority continues in life. When it has disappeared, another majority is in place. Hold all the rights and powers their predecessors once held, and may change their laws and institutions to suit themselves." Okay. Thus, Spooner, in a prominent sense, was engaged in reviving the stand of the critics of Thomas Hobbes and the social contract theory, who held that the only persons bound to such an agreement were those actually participating in a pact of submission to a ruler. Therefore, being unable to act for anyone but themselves, they could certainly be unable to bind their posterity to an unchanging order. So basically saying, if you didn't sign the contract, you're under no obligation to fulfill it or to abide by the rules in said contract. Looking at the Constitution as a contract, or looking at the formation of a federal government as a contract, the men who signed on for that are the only ones that are obligated to follow the rules of that contract. I don't remember ever signing anything when I was born that says I'm going to submit to this. Do you? The principal onslaughts in this last pamphlet were directed at the voting, tax-paying, and lawmaking functions performed under the representative democracy. It was his contention that neither participation in elections nor the paying of taxes were valid evidence of either support or attachment to the Constitution, despite general assertions in the affirmative. The manner in which these functions were performed precluded such an interpretation. A voluntary vote indicated support of the basic document of government. However, denoted Spooner, the restricted number allowed access to the ballot made the process the obvious workings of a minority. He's talking about, who had voting rights at the time. Without citing actual statistics, he estimated that no more than one sixth of the entire nation's population had access to the voting booths, and only a fraction of those qualified actually performed the act of voting. So a fraction of a fraction actually voted, and based on that vote, just like today, if you add the amount of votes that Kamala Harris got to the amount of votes that Donald Trump got, it still adds up, I believe. Now, however close it might be, I'm damn near certain, okay? I haven't done the math in almost a year because that's when the election was. But I'm damn near certain that if you added those two numbers together, it would equal less than half of the total population, of the voting population of this country. That in itself means that a minority of people are telling a vast amount of the majority what to do. They are they're giving a government mandate to a group of people that were elected by a fraction of the actual population of this place. Anywho, okay, here we go. 1/6 of the entire nation's population had access to voting booths, and only a fraction of those qualified actually performed the act of voting. Therefore, all those failing to vote technically withheld their support of the Constitution. That's the point I'm trying to make. And I should have just continued reading. And thus the government was clearly a conscious product of a minority. This was not his only argument. He questioned the possibility of determining those who actually voted voluntarily, as well as specifically locating the voluntary supporters, quote unquote, voluntary supporters of any given government. He goes on to say, as everybody who supports the Constitution by voting does so secretly and in a way to avoid all personal responsibility for the acts of his agents or representatives, it cannot legally or reasonably be said that anybody at all supports the Constitution by voting. No man can reasonably or legally be said to do such a thing as to assent to or support the Constitution unless he does it openly and in a way to make himself personally responsible for the acts of his agents, so long as they act within the limits of the power he delegates to them. So the next time one of the presidents of the United States orders drone strikes on a wedding, killing innocent people, or killing American citizens with drone strikes, or the next time the government sends billions of dollars off to Israel so they can go and blow kids to pieces over in Palestine, where they can literally just murder, it's over 20,000 children, just children, in the time since, October 7th. They've murdered 20,000 plus children. And one of the biggest financial backers of that is the United States through the involuntary taxation that they take from people. Maybe next time, the people who vote for these people, what if you were the ones held accountable for war crimes because you voted these people in? Wouldn't you be a little bit more weary of your religious fervor that you have for statism? The secret ballot he looked upon as a source of two kinds of evil. It enabled groups of people who were not in accord to continue acting without an understanding, and to look forward with expectancy to belonging to the more numerous group in the hopes of thus forcing their desires and wills upon the other. In addition, it permitted the rise of an office-holding group which operated in an irresponsible vacuum, blessed with anonymity through the secret ballot, which destroyed the possibility of planting specific responsibility. Spooner goes on to say, the secret ballot makes a secret government. Open despotism is better than this. The secret despot stands out in the face of all men and says, I am the state. My will is law. I am your master. I take the responsibility of my acts. But a secret government is little better than a government of assassins. The combination of the secret ballot and Article 1, Section 6 of the Constitution served to demolish any notions remaining that a government of open responsibility was intended. Elected to office by people whom they did not know, senators and representatives were protected by this part of the Constitution from responsibility for any legislation which they might subsequently pass while in this office. The right to vote out incumbents every 2, 4, or 6 years was no remedy for this situation. They were merely replaced by others who exercised similar, quote-unquote, absolute and irresponsible power. A person injured by the passage of legislation was unable to place responsibility upon a single person either inside or outside the legislative halls, and least of all the latter. Quote, these pretended agents of the people and everybody are really the agents of nobody. The claim of legislators to being the representatives of the people, while at the time being granted immunity by the Constitution for their actions as legislators, he decried a contradiction, since one could not be responsible and irresponsible for the same thing at the same time. How much more? In like manner, the payment of taxes was no more a valid method of determining voluntary support to the Constitution than participation in voting. The theory that taxes were paid voluntarily was involved in this interpretation, disregarding the practical fact that most tax remittances were made under the compulsion of threat. Taxpayers acceded to the policies of the abstraction the government through fear of jail, confiscation, or violence should they make physical resistance. Unable to determine the nature of the government, the individual knew only the tax collector, another person representing himself as an agent of this government, and payment was made with no comprehension of the destination of eventual disposal of his money. He warned that a tax structure of this kind was a serious threat to liberty, since all political power eventually depended upon money, and the entity controlling the money collected in taxes might pursue a course of action ruinous to the very supplier of the funds thus utilized. That taxes might be justified on the basis that collection was made by some men from other men for the purpose of protecting them, he labeled as perfect absurdity. He considered individuals competent enough to make their own arrangements of this kind, and certainly no warrant existed for the protection of anyone against his will. Advised Spooner, quote, "The only security men can have for their political liberty consists in keeping their money in their own pockets, until they have assurances perfectly satisfactory to themselves that it will be used for their benefit," end quote. The no treason blast touched other items of controversial content. Oaths given by government officials, soldiers, naturalized persons, and the late rebels of the South he dismissed as, quote, "of no validity or obligation," end quote, due to the inability of specifically designating to whom they were given. Pledges to support the Constitution in the name of the people of the United States or similar generalities were written off as ineffective and inadequate. Nor did he believe that the governments of European countries entertained degrees of political virtue lacking in his own land. The monarchies of Europe he described as corrupt alliances between discredited royalties and large continental banking houses. Large continental banking houses. What is a banking houses? Since the latter supplied the funds which equipped and paid the various armies, the power of the national states of Europe logically lay in the control of finance capitalism. It was impossible for a ruling house to survive in any other way. Adequate credit relations had to be maintained with the banks to remain in power, while these latter received the benefits derived from the exploitation of the taxpayers, trade relations with weaker neighbors and satellites, and the regimentation of the submerged colonial peoples of the respective countries. Our diplomatic relations with these lands were thus involving the United States government with even less worthy individuals acting in a supposed representative capacity on their own part. In spite of the extremity and provocativeness of his attacks upon both the theory and practice of government in the United States, it is unlikely that Lysander Spooner's writings excited more than local intellectual curiosity. For over 10 years after the completion of the No Treason series, his writings in defense of anarchism were buried in a number of treatises on free banking. Due to his preference for non-associative criticism, it is probable that Spooner might have remained in obscurity for the remainder of his time had not the great increase of anarchist writing and periodical publication of the period after 1880 brought some of his defenses of anti-statism to the attention of wide international reading audiences of radical bent. The publication of his pamphlet Natural Law, which there's a reading for on this channel, in 1882 came to the attention of anarchist groups both in the United States and Europe. A short while later, as an independent contributor to Liberty, his standing in the anarchist camp grew rapidly. Natural Law was an essay on political and social philosophy primarily, but written to establish the thesis that human legislation was impotent and futile when made in ignorance, conscious or otherwise, of the principle of justice embodied in natural law. Spooner's primary objective was to establish the principles of natural law in what he termed the science of justice, which he said stemmed from the phenomenon of natural rights. Each person either came into the world with these rights, or else he passed his existence without them. For clearly they were not capable of being manufactured and distributed by men at some undesignated time later on. What was known as justice merely defined what rights all obtained at birth. And to deny that such was the case put all discussions of justice and rights forever off the agenda of humanity. If there was no natural principle of justice, then the possibility of moral standard did not exist, and the concepts of justice and injustice themselves were absolutely meaningless. Furthermore, the concept of crime was a mere imagination, and all that transpired on earth resembled natural occurrences such as rainstorms and growth of vegetation. Spooner said, if justice be not a natural principle, governments have no reason to take cognizance of a non-entity, and all their professions of establishing justice or of maintaining justice are simply the gibberish of fools. On the other hand, if it were admitted that there was such a thing as a natural principle of justice, then it must of necessity be, no more susceptible to alteration or change than gravitation. Okay? Thus, there was no place for the legislation of men in this situation either, for it was an assumption of authority and dominion, where the right to do so did not exist, nor where the necessity for such was needed. Thus there was a science of justice, quote, that each should live honestly toward each other, end quote, which was capable of being learned as were the other sciences. In fact, he insisted that for the most part, the fundamentals of the science of justice were often learned and practiced before the words which were used to describe it were understood. So if you go and listen to my recording of this essay, he uses children as an example, that children, like, we just have this understanding that there's this weird, and I'm paraphrasing here, that there's this strange, weird, like, just, I don't know, inherent understanding from childhood about property rights. That's my toy, give it back type stuff. Anyways, to continue, and we're going to finish up real soon, a couple more pages. How then were governments and legislation to be accounted for? To Spooner, both were subversions of natural justice and natural law, growing from an attempt of a portion of mankind to live off production of the remainder, and extended as far back in history as the period when the systematic cultivation of the soil made possible an accumulation of material wealth in excess of that needed for daily need on the part of the cultivators. From the actual slavery of both the producer and his product, there evolved an emancipation from the former condition. The retention of ownership of land and the means of production made it mandatory that the newly freed in body, quote unquote, sell their labor, which practically restored the former situation. The relative mobility of the non-owning group and the tendency for the earning of a living to become lodged in a groove of unending insecurity promoted a large volume of social disruptions, such as stealing. This prompted the passage of numerous laws defining such activities as crimes, quote, to keep these dangerous people in subjection, end quote. There was just one purpose for the formation of the historic state. To quote, simply to keep one class of men in subordination and servitude to another, end quote. As unpalatable as such an interpretation might prove to be among other shades of society, conservative, liberal, or radical, the fact that natural law, his essay, went into 3 editions in 3 years indicated the acceptability of its message among the anarchists. Spooner, now living in retirement in Boston, contributed 2 final editions to the anti-state literature, which, although producing little new thought, were the most amazing and daring of all in that they were addressed to prominent public figures in American political life. Shortly after the appearance of Natural Law, his letter to Thomas F. Bayard was featured in Liberty. Using the veteran Delaware senator as a symbol of representative government, which he despised so thoroughly, the unregenerated Boston anarchist summed up his arguments against the delegation of legislative power, the secret ballot, the passage of legislation, and the validity of the Constitution. In the summer of 1885, Tucker began the publication of Spooner's A Letter to Grover Cleveland on his false, self-contradictory, and ridiculous inaugural address, which ran through 19 lengthy installments and ended shortly after the Haymarket explosion, when the first genuine crisis in American radical activities was precipitated. So the Haymarket explosion, I'm pretty sure he's referring to what's more commonly referred to as the Haymarket Affair. This is footnote number 135. And we'll be discussing that in a couple. We'll be discussing that next week, a little bit more next week. This was the most elaborate of all of the summations which he was to contrive, and like his manifestos addressed to Bayard, synthesized his early contributions with little new material added. To the readers of Liberty, it was a work of contemporary freshness, and it achieved sufficient popularity among them to warrant publication shortly after in book form. His association with the growing number of Tuckerites stimulated him to even more drastic repudiations of the state. He invade against the right of the state to take the life of anyone, or interfere with men's individual private contracts, or erect monopolies of land or money to the benefit of some at the expense of others. He went on to ridicule the concept of public rights, as he had long before, and several other generalities and platitudes from the Cleveland inaugural speech. He denied the existence of a public trust, generally cited as the wellspring of authority vested in the presidency. He declared that the devotion to the public welfare would inevitably lead to the destruction of men's individual rights under the guise of promoting their prosperity. He reserved his most eloquent contempt for the party system, which he thought a type of game which stimulated artificial relationships of antagonism among men naturally undisposed to belligerency, promoting synthetic conflict for the purposes of aggrandizing crafty leaders. In no less vigorous manner did he depreciate the activities transpiring in what the president had described as the halls of natural legislation. To Spooner, these were mere cockpits to which the lawmakers invited the representatives of all conceivable conflicting interests, where the former might, quote, favor or oppose according as they can better serve their own personal interests and ambitions by doing the one or the other, end quote. At the same time, he commented acidly on the patronizing attitude of the political elements in taking credit for such material prosperity as was enjoyed, while continuing the process of vitiating the efforts of non-political individuals and encouraging an increasing degree of dependence upon the ability of the government, now fully engaged in supplying a favorable state of affairs wherein the favored monopolies might function. Spooner's death in 1887 brought to an end both his pamphleteering and his anonymous contributions to liberty at the time when the nationwide loose affiliation of anti-government intellectuals was at its peak. With this group, his prestige grew with the passing of time, so that some 20 years later, examining their antecedents, those with a historical bent were willing to admit that Spooner's contributions to American anarchism were fully as important as Josiah Warren's. The undecorated egoistic doctrines of Max Steiner were already looming in the writings of the Tucker Group. Intruding on their on the earlier basis of anarchist thinking and altering some of the tenaciously held concepts, especially those dealing with the abstraction of natural right. The flowering of American anarchism under the leadership of Benjamin Tucker and the gradual swing to intellectual egoism is a many-sided and personality-filled account best considered in relation to new circumstances which tended to modify the contributions of its important forerunners. Okay, so that's going to do it for this week's reading, I think. And so, yeah, well, I don't think, I know. Anyways, I have, where is it? I have a book. I have many books, but this one is called Let's Abolish Government. I'm trying to see if I can find it on the shelf without taking up too much time. Anywho, yeah, it's called Let's Abolish Government. And it's a compilation of Lysander Spooner's work. And I can't find it. I wanted to, anyways, yeah, it's called Let's Abolish Government. And I gotta reorganize my stuff over here. Anyways, yeah, so check out the recordings that I did of some of Spooner's work. It's really, really great. Some of the things that he goes into because of how true it still remains today, right? So it's really great stuff. Oh, we got Discern Between Truth and Fiction. Says, "Hey James, thanks for reading this." He goes on to say, "It sounds like it was powerless and is to stop it." But yeah, the Constitution. Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't seem like it's powerful enough to stop what this country is kind of turning into, you know? Yeah, it's really sad because when you go through and you read the Constitution, like there is a lot in there that is recognizing natural law rights. Okay, like the whole idea is that human beings have rights granted to them by God, not by other men. And here are those rights. And government, if there's going to be one, should pledge to never never violate those rights. And they set out to create a more perfect union of states when the federal government was formed. based on natural law rights, that they wouldn't violate people's natural law rights. And they've done basically the exact opposite of that. Although the Constitution was never going to stop anybody, any group or individual, or individuals making up a group, should they choose to identify themselves as a group. The Constitution is a piece of paper with words on it. It was never meant to stop anybody. Okay, what we have to understand is that there has been a incrementalist tactic that has been going on for well over 100 years now to subvert our freedoms and to just steadily take them away in different forms and fashions, seemingly while no one's looking. Oh, look over there at that tragic thing that happened. And meanwhile, there's like, oh, we got to take away some freedoms now because people feel unsafe. Holy shit. This is kind of the Fabian socialist tactic of, cut off their supply lines. Like Fabius Maximus was this Roman general, and he was laughed at because he was like, we're not going to fight them head on. We're going to attack their supply lines. We're going to trap them in this valley, and we're going to fight this war by just kind of starving them out. And we're going to, do these little things here and there. Just, and before you know it, they're not going to realize what's going on because they're expecting a fight right in front of them, and we're not going to give them that. And the Romans were like, fuck you, dude. We're warriors. We're not going to do this shit. But eventually the war with, I think it was Hannibal, got so bad that they had no choice but to listen to this Fabius Maximus fella. And, and it worked. His tactic worked. And they won the war, or at least they won the battles, and the tactic began to work. And now we have, these Fabian socialists, you look up Fabian socialists on there, and the London School of Economics, Fabian socialists, people like H.G. Wells, he was a Fabian socialist. I think it was John D. Rockefeller, ended up going to the London School of Economics. That was opened up by the Fabian socialists. There's a lot of prominent people that were Fabian socialists, and they have machinations to usher in a one world government. Lord Milner teamed up with the Fabians and they kind of worked together for the English speaking idea that was brought forth by Lord Milner and Cecil Rhodes, John Ruskin. Anyways, John Ruskin gives a speech. Cecil Rhodes hears the speech. He thinks that the British Empire can rise again, but they need to fold America back in or else it'll never happen. There's contention of how it should happen. Cecil Rhodes is nearing his deathbed. There he's getting, in touch with Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie's like, yeah, we'll do this. Like, I'll help make it happen. But Carnegie's like, oh, I think America should be the tip of the spear on this because of, all these different things. Like, I found this out in a book called The Killing of Uncle Sam and Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley. The Killing of Uncle Sam is by the same guy that did Operation Gladio. That book is, where is that book? Right here. Okay, so The Killing of Uncle Sam is by Rodney Howard Brown and Paul L. Williams. Paul L. Williams wrote Operation Gladio. And I forget what else Rodney Howard Brown has written. But yeah, Paul L. Williams is got quite a library of work behind him. He likes to expose the Vatican. So anyways, what I was saying was what was I saying? So the Fabian socialists, they do these small little incremental nudges And that's what we've been going through. The Constitution doesn't have anything in it to prevent this from happening, aside from the Second Amendment. But and then there's the rest of that. All right. So, anyways, what's been going on with me? Where have I been for a month? Well, doing this every week, staying up late, it makes you tired. I would like to spend some more time with my wife. I would like to kind of relax a little bit more. I've been really busy at my day job. I've been really busy at work, trying to make a living and support my family. And I'm happy to do so. And it leaves me with very little energy at the end of the week, trying to recuperate from that. And not only all that, but I meant to come back a couple weeks ago, and maybe somebody saw my stream pop up and they were like, "Oh, where did it go? Why isn't it up?" I had to cut off the stream. I was going to read the Lysander Spooner stuff probably like 3 weeks ago. But we had just recently got a puppy. So there's a puppy at our house now, and this puppy is freaking so cool. Her name is Pepper, and she's over there right now. And a few weeks ago, she was still kind of new, and she was nervous at night, and she didn't know, and she was just like kind of barking in the background, and I didn't want to record that way. I have a pretty profound respect for my audience, and I don't want you guys to be listening to that kind of background noise if I can help it. So the past few weeks, I've been training the dog to be quiet at night. This past week, as you may have just witnessed, if you're watching, I have kind of a cold going on. I'm getting over it. I've got coughs, but I wanted to get it done. I wanted to jump back on and get something on the record before, before anyone thought that I drifted off into obscurity and that I wasn't coming back or whatever. But no, I'm here. And I'm here with a better overlay these days too. And so obviously we're gonna oh, Jerry. Okay. Sorry. Jerry from my buddy Jerry from Autonomy. Pepper is a mix between a purebred Australian Shepherd and I forget what the other parent is. But the other parent is it's kind of a mutt, like a couple different things. Anyways. Yeah. She's a good little puppy, very sweet, loves the kids, and she's a fast learner. I'm very excited to have this addition in our family, and it's really great to see the kids having fun with a dog. Had a dog before, a pretty big dog, and he had to go live with a friend of mine because we weren't ready. Not to be those types of people, but it was very, very complicated the way the dog came to us, the previous dog, how the previous dog came to us. We were in the process of getting him trained, and he nipped at my newborn baby daughter at the time. And you don't fuck around when it's a 97-pound pit bull Great Dane mix nipping at your baby daughter. You figure it out right away. And that's what I did. And instead of calling animal control, calling the state where they would probably need a reason to come take him, and they'd probably kill him, I called a friend of mine, very good friend, very close friend of mine, and he came about 2 hours later. The dog already knew him because my friend comes over all the time, and now he lives with him, and he's been with my friend Will for almost 5 years. So he's been at a very good home. So we consider it more of like a foster situation because we had Max for about 8 months, and then he had to go and live someplace else, which is sad, but he's better. He's in a better place, like physically in a better place, not like some weird like, oh, he's dead now. Anyways, I'm gonna move to wrapping it up. I want to thank everybody for tuning in and sticking with me, or whatever. The one person who did in the live stream, and the guy who asked if I was a communist earlier in the stream, dude. That's hilarious. You don't know where you are. That's funny. But I would like for, in all honesty, I'm making fun of communists. I do not like communism. I, in fact, hate communists. I think they're despicable people. But I would like to aid in healing them of their mental sickness of thinking that private property rights don't exist, or personal property rights don't exist. And they'll say, that's not what it is. But it's like, no, that's exactly what it is. Thank you, Jerry. I had a great time doing this live stream tonight. And before I go, I would like to remind everybody to take a look at the show notes. You can get your own copy of this PDF. It's very exciting to be able to provide, like, I did the work. I went and found the PDF. I'm making it really easy for you to get your own copy of it. You can download it right from my website, right from voluntaristacademy.com. You can go over there and check out more stuff. There's so many more PDFs of like everything I've ever read on this channel, and even more than I've read on this channel is available at voluntaristacademy.com. And if you're there and you really like this stream, or you like this information, I know my delivery's rough around the edges. I don't pronounce everything correctly all the time, and that's part of the fun of it. That's part of the fun of it. Is like I get to have a laugh at myself. You guys get to laugh, and we all learn a little bit more as we go, and that's a wonderful thing. While you're over at voluntaristacademy.com, you could be a sponsor of the show, and you could help keep the show going and growing by signing up to be a sponsor, to be a member, and I'm trying to figure out all this stuff. And you could also check out my gaming channel, which I don't have a link for or anything like that, but maybe I'll put one in there. You can check out my gaming channel, my gaming channel, Killicadogan. It's fun. I like to just kick back, relax, and just stream some gaming, and nothing wrong with that. So, and here, what am I trying to defend it? No, I'm just saying I don't judge anybody for going and playing a couple, a little time, spend a little time, kick back, relax after a long week at work, play some video games. You've earned it, pal. I work my fucking ass off all week long to support this house and to support my children and my wife, who stays home to homeschool our children and to keep everything afloat, to make sure that everything's getting paid for. And in my spare time, I like to teach people about natural law. I like to teach people about voluntarism. That's why it's called Voluntarist Academy. If you would like to help me keep this operation going and growing, because what I make at my day job, it supports the roof, the clothes, the food, and all that stuff. This operation, what you're watching, is completely crowdfunded. Like, it's 100%. I do it. Like I actually work a kind of a second job to support this, but at the same time, it's like I could really use a little bit of help every now and then. So if you want to donate to the show, you can go over to voluntaristacademy.com and find your preferred way of donating. There's like a few different ways over there. If you'd like to become a member and become a sponsor of the show, you can do so as well at buymeacoffee.com. All these links are in the show notes. Very excited because, like, if you become a sponsor, then we get to hang out, because like I'll dedicate time to come and hang out, and we can discuss things in a Zoom meeting about the material covered on the channel, and we'll have a Discord server as well. So it's really exciting stuff. Also, guys, seriously, this is like I'm pretty sure it's like 0 hour to get in on Autonomy Season 14. If you're like feeling stuck in life and you're feeling like the walls are closing in and you need a change, or you need to like get out of a scarcity mindset and like get into one of abundance, where you, instead of thinking like there's never enough, and you could change your whole mindset, like with what you could learn in autonomy, you could change your whole mindset into one of abundance, like where you can improvise, adapt, and overcome, and figure out creative ways to make money. And you could take this teaching and not feel that weird anxiety feeling anymore. You do the work, but Richard Grove teaches the autonomy course, the 12-week course, and right now is like the 0 hour, I'm pretty sure, to get in on the lifetime enrollment. After season 14, it's the payment model is changing completely. So if you want lifetime enrollment instead of like a monthly payment, now is the time to do it. There's a link in the show notes that you can click right now, and you could hop over there, figure out if autonomy is right for you, enroll into autonomy, and it could change your life completely. I mean, if you're feeling now like how I felt a couple years ago before I took the autonomy course, like in 6 months, you'll thank yourself for joining autonomy and getting taught by Richard Grove, who has 20 plus years of like sales experience. And sales doesn't necessarily just mean making cold calls all day. Like we all practice sales, whether we're conscious of it or not, every day, like all day, every day. We're constantly finding ways to communicate with people, to communicate our ideas, to communicate our skills, and to make sure that like we're providing for ourselves and or our families. And so that is sales in a manner of speaking. So if you want to improve on these skills, your active listening abilities, your communication skills, your ability to have a mindset of abundance instead of living in scarcity, you should seriously consider joining the autonomy course, taking the course, and seeing what it can do for you to expand to expand your abilities, to really break free. Because that's the whole point of what I try to communicate with this material, and what you could learn from a course like autonomy is breaking free from kind of the script that's been written for you. To take a quote from John Taylor Gatto, we're kind of all living, or a lot of us have been trained to live according to the script that somebody else wrote. But in fact, it's our birthright to write our own script in life. It's our natural law of rights to be able to compose our own script in life. We all have a lot of work to do to be able to do that. And if you're feeling stuck, I think autonomy could be right for you. You could book a blueprint phone call. You could, take the primer, all these things that are free. But if you click that link in the show notes now, you got to walk before you can run, right? But you got to take the first step somewhere. So click that link. See if it's right for you. Book a blueprint call. Enroll. Let's go. What are you waiting for? And then other than that, I think that might actually be it. So without any further ado, I'm going to get out of here because it's been almost 3 hours. I can't believe it. 3 hours. It's a long one. Shout out to Jerry, who's been in the chat. Thanks for showing up, pal. Really appreciate you. Jerry's a good friend. Shout out to my good friend Phoenix Aurora for kindly, if you're listening to this, Phoenix, thank you for kindly reminding me to be a little bit more enthusiastic about some things. You really know how to get right to the core of me, pal. I really appreciated that little pep talk you gave me the other day. So, yeah, I think that's all I got, other than to just remind you all that, yeah, we hear a lot about, taxation is theft. Taxation is theft. it's more than that. It's slavery. Taxation is slavery. If you're not able to say no without threat of violence and being locked in a cell, then you're no better than a slave was or is. You know, and who the fuck are they to enslave us? Because you know what, like we always say here at Voluntaryist Academy, you own yourself, period. No one else owns you. You are a free person. It's your natural, it's your inherent right to be free. And the best way to secure our individual freedoms is to recognize that those individual freedoms also belong to everyone else. And voluntarism is all about the coexistence and the consensual relationships between people who understand these things, and to the people who don't understand, well, we're trying to reach out and teach you. Please listen, because we all benefit in the long run. Voluntarism is the solution. Okay? It's based on natural law. And it's a complete rejection of coercive tactics to enslave your fellow man. So, but we can't do it alone. No man can do it alone. You can change yourself, you can change the world, but we all got to change ourselves if we really want to have a long-lasting impact. All right, I'm done. I love you all. Peace.